Mr. Chairman, at this point I would like to raise a parliamentary inquiry.
Can I say one thing first?
Yes.
Our last speaker will be Daniel McGroarty of the American Resources Policy Network, and I have been told by staff that he was invited at the last minute, so we appreciate your ability to be here given the lateness of the request. And now, Mr. Ranking Member, did you have a comment?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, is it not true that Committee Rule 4A applies, which requires that each witness to appear must submit to the committee at least 2 working days before the appearance a written testimony, and failure to do so could result in barring the testimony? I believe that applies.
I do. I do believe that applies.
I'm not trying to make trouble here, and I will agree to the witness continuing. I just want to make the point that having the testimony in advance is really important for the committee and the committee staff to be able to prepare for the hearing. And I don't know whether this was because the witness was invited too late or the witness was slow providing the testimony. I don't know. All I know is without the prepared testimony, it makes it more difficult for us.
Well, Mr. Holt, that is a point well taken, and we certainly don't want to blame the witness because he was invited late, so we'll blame it on the committee, the staff, myself, for not having been far enough in advance on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But that is a point
I withdraw my parliamentary objection and inquiry.
Okay, thank you. Now to you, Mr. McGroarty.
My thanks to the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. My organization, the American Resource Policy Network, is a newly launched experts forum dedicated to informing public opinion and public policy on the importance of developing U.S. mineral resources. I'm also a member of the board of directors of Colorado Rare Earths, a publicly held development company. The subject before this subcommittee, the concept of critical minerals, the potential for supply disruption, has become front-page news, particularly after the de facto embargo imposed by China against Japan last fall, in the wake of a dispute over claims involving mineral rights beneath the East China Sea. Some consider this a case of China test-firing a resource weapon. Others point to China's rapid growth as the reason it is cutting back exports and using more rare earths at home. In the end, whether China withholds its rare earths or consumes them, the result is the same: a shortage of metals critical to our technological and economic development as well as our national security. In April, I took part in a rare earths conference in Shenyang, China. My informal conversations with Chinese attendees followed a well-worn track. They hear that the U.S. is studying the rare earths, issuing reports, and writing bills. They hear that American companies are taking steps to develop rare earths mines. Their immediate question is, do you have your permits? How many tons will the mine produce? How soon? The message is unmistakable. If there's a resource race, China is in full sprint. They see us standing at the starting line. This issue goes well beyond the rare earths. Take what I call the single scariest page. We've already seen it in any government document, page 6 of the U.S. Geological Survey annual report. 18 metals, 100% dependent. 13 more, 80 to 99% dependent. Compare that with foreign oil, where the U.S. imports only 57%. In fact, if oil were on the USGS list, it would appear in 42nd place. Look further down that list and you'll see mainstay metals like copper in increasing demand and at increasing risk. In addition to its commercial uses, copper is critical for defense applications. DoD reports show that copper ranks second behind aluminum in annual consumption for defense industrial applications. Compared to near 100% dependency for rare earths, the fact that the U.S. today imports 30% of the copper we consume may seem manageable, even acceptable. But to put that number in perspective, look back to 1993, the year the last metric ton of copper was sold out of the National Defense Stockpile. In 1993, U.S. mines produced 1.8 million metric tons of copper, roughly 60% more than 2010. Our net import dependency was 7%, not 30% as it is today. As for disruption, the key concern of this subcommittee, an OSD study lists copper as a metal that has, and I quote, already caused some kind of significant weapon system production delay for DoD. If the U.S. were simply to stop mining copper today, there are known copper prospects in a number of countries. Chile, Peru, the Philippines might step up supply. Or demand might be met through mines in Russia, Angola, Afghanistan, DRC Congo, or China, including decisions taken in Beijing to exploit copper reserves in the Tibet Autonomous Region. There's also copper in Pakistan and Iran. With the exception of Pakistan, rated partly free, all of the latter group are rated not free in the current Freedom House Index. So while the world copper market does offer choices, we might find those choices unpalatable from a policy perspective. In the end, base metals and technology metals aren't so easy to separate. Take rhenium, we've already heard. Rhenium isn't mined, but rather recovered during the processing of copper and molybdenum, captured in the flue dust thrown off by the roasters. Otherwise, rhenium literally goes up in smoke. Rhenium is used today in jet engines like those in the Boeing 777. In the national security sphere, you'll find rhenium in rocket thrusters that reposition geosync satellites, high-performance test engines that power the F-15, F-16, F-18, and the new F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, as well as in stealth aircraft. Global rhenium production is minuscule, 52 tons worldwide. That's roughly the weight of about 24 SUVs, but the need is critical. The U.S. imports 86% of its rhenium, much of it in recent years from Chile and Kazakhstan. Once again, we face critical questions about a critical material. Will the market supply sufficient rhenium for our commercial and national security needs? Are we comfortable with the geopolitical risk implicit in 86% foreign dependency? Should we add rhenium to the national defense stockpile? Or incentivize American copper and moly producers to invest in technologies necessary to capture rhenium now lost in the roasting process? Similar questions can be asked about several dozen minerals, and it's my hope through this subcommittee that they will be. We cannot maintain our modern economy without a steady supply of metals and minerals. Those we do not possess here at home, we must source from other countries. But those we possess, but choose not to produce, perpetuate needless foreign dependence, leverage other nations may use to America's disadvantage. We must recognize resource security as a national strategic imperative. Thank you.
No, we appreciate those questions, so thank you very much. Next we have on the list Mr. Flores of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to agree with Mr. Duncan's comments to start with. It seems like it's deja vu all over again. We hear continuing testimony from witnesses in industry and in business and consumers about the things we do as a country that reflect a lack of foresight when it comes to taxation, regulation, restriction to our public access to public lands that continue to damage our economy, damage our way of living, and to bankrupt the future of our kids and grandkids. And I'm quite frankly fatigued from hearing us continue to go that wrong direction. Mr. McGroarty, did I pronounce that correctly? Your comments were particularly poignant, I thought, when you talked about what you heard in China, and I want you to repeat what you heard, that they understand that we talk a lot, but what was their question? Where are the permits? Can you repeat that?
Flores, you're absolutely right, and it's done in a very courteous way, with a lot of respect. But there's a certain impatience there when you're having the conversations. Ideology aside, the Chinese bureaucrat is an extraordinarily pragmatic individual at this point in the year 2011. We would have a discussion, and I was in one of less than a handful.
Let's keep it short.
Yeah, non-Chinese presenters.
Okay.
And they would immediately cut in and say, how many million tons? How soon? Where are your permits? They were telling us basically, we're doing this, you're talking about it.
Okay. It reminds me of that commercial some of us have seen on TV where you have the Chinese laughing about how we drove our country toward bankruptcy and they owned us because of the fact that they financed us.
Thank you. Next we have Representative Gosar from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. McGroarty. In your testimony, we're going to switch up a little bit here. You state that U.S. mines produced 1.8 metric tons of copper in '93, roughly 60% more than produced last year. In the same time period, you stated that world copper reserves have more than doubled, but the U.S. reserves have declined from 15% to 5%. What accounts for the drastic decrease over less than 20 years? Has the United States simply tapped a larger simply tapped a larger proportion of its ore deposits than the rest of the world? Are we just failing to get these projects off the ground?
Right. Congressman Gosar, that's a very good question. The answer has to do with exploration budgets. How much time on task, how many dollars did the U.S. mining industry put into exploring and expanding U.S. copper reserves? There's a general decrease. Most of the exploration money is going into gold and silver, gold and diamonds rather, and less so into copper. There's an issue about exhausting the current resource and not replacing it. You had testimony several years ago about the fact that we would need upwards of a dozen new mines brought on to replace mines that are basically reaching end of life of mine. I think it ties back to some of the points that Mr. Quinn has made. If the permitting process in the United States is extraordinarily long, capital required is very, very high, and companies just learn to look elsewhere in the world to develop the resource.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I asked because I recently introduced legislation H.R. 1904, a bill that would open up the third largest undeveloped copper resource in the world. How critical to our national security is it to ensure deposits like the one located in central Arizona can be opened up for production? And considering the prevalence of copper in alternative technologies like hybrid cars, solar panels, wind turbines, isn't the meteoric rise on our dependence for foreign minerals such as copper over the past 20 years an alarming national security risk? If we're truly trying to reduce our dependence on foreign fuels, isn't it critical we use domestic resources to construct alternative energy infrastructure?
I'd agree. I think the signals are there. I mentioned the OSD study that indicates without any specificity that there's already been some sort of program disruption. And copper is one of the metals that was mentioned in that category. That's not a new study. That's from several years ago. So the signal's being sent. Your indication about the increasing utility of copper is true as well. Copper has been used in automobiles for a long, long time, but the hybrids use something like twice the amount of copper. So the cars that we want to trend to, encourage people to drive, are going to create a larger requirement rather than a smaller requirement.
I think you're right. I think the average turbine uses over 4 tons of copper just in that matrices of alternative energy, if I'm not mistaken, so thank you. Permitting in my district is concerned because I've got the actual numbers. I mean, when we start looking at this, the average number for a NEPA to be processed in my district, in District 1 in Arizona, is 5.9 years and growing. And it seems that we've got an increased numbers of lawsuits that have been curtailed. I'd like to start with you first and ask you, how has the lawsuits using the equal access to justice funding affected your ability to actually mine and have access to these ores?
My understanding of the permitting process is limited to my involvement with the rare earths company in Colorado, so I'll yield to others on the panel who maybe have a better idea. Generally speaking, time is money.
Mr. Quinn, can you answer that question for me, please?
In terms of how it's impacted, what I can say is this: you basically have a law there that pays people, has the taxpayer reimburse people to stop the projects. I don't have any metrics on how much money has been spent in that regard. There's, as you're inferring, Congressman, that there's ample opportunity for opponents to mining projects to slice and dice them through the litigation process.
Isn't it true that it's basically an ecological terrorism type aspect when we know that one envelope with one postage stamp at the last day of a recourse could be starting the whole process all over again?
Well, I could certainly say this, that a low level investment can stop a huge investment. A postage stamp and a signature on a protest can stop a $1 billion project.
Thank you. I've got more questions, but I'll take them on my line. How is the American consumer and the industry being extorted by artificially raising prices by foreign markets? Mr. McGroarty, can you address that a little bit for me, please?
Congressman, you raised an interesting question. My thought goes to how one would cost out lost innovation as well. Unavailability of resources, the general sense that one would not be pursuing and exploring new applications because you don't feel that you can source the components the precursor metals. It has to have some sort of drag effect. I don't know how one would measure it. I'm not an economist.
But you could really agree with me that the American taxpayers are going to be one fronting this because it's artificially inflated.
Yes, I think so. You phrase it in terms of consumers, and I'm thinking also, you know, what would the consumer not have 5 years from now? And how would they even know they don't have it?
And so it's our own federal government that's standing in the way of that marketplace.
I think the federal government can make changes.
Thank you.
You talked about permitting.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes the witness portion of the question portion of this hearing. We're going to wrap up now. I'd like to submit for the record 2 articles from the New York Times regarding the issue of Chinese mineral embargoes without objection. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, taking of their valuable time to come and help us understand this important issue. While today's hearing was focused on what we know from the National Research Council reports and our expert witnesses, there is still much we don't know. We don't know what areas are open for mineral development or the minerals requirements for domestic manufacturing, infrastructure, and national defense. We don't know fully the status of the workforce with mining and materials expertise or a decent assessment of permitting timelines for projects on federal lands with its associated litigation and hurdles to domestic development. But we need these answers. Later this week, I will be introducing legislation to direct the Department of the Interior to prepare a series of reports to get the answers we need to address the challenges laid out in this hearing today. The goal of this legislation is to increase both our understanding of our national mineral needs and the barriers to meeting our needs with domestic production. Our national mineral policy is failing our nation. It is failing to keep us supplied with the resources we need to defend our nation, build our infrastructure, create jobs, secure our manufacturing base, and keep our economy healthy. Today is the beginning of an effort to right the course and restore America's leadership in minerals and materials technology. Members of the committee may have additional questions for each of you witnesses. For the record, I ask that you would respond to these in writing. And if there is no further question, without objection, we stand adjourned.